The Instagram account that would eventually become central evidence in an international murder investigation still exists online, preserved as digital memorial to a vibrant life cut short and stark warning about trust, misplaced in dangerous circumstances far from home. The final posts from Emily Rodriguez's profile show a radiant 29-year-old California native posing against breathtaking Mexican landscapes, turquoise Caribbean waters in Cancun, ancient pyramids at Teotihuacan, colorful colonial architecture in Mexico City. Her captions documenting what began as a joyful reunion with college friends for a destination wedding, but transformed into extended solo adventure that she described as finding myself in the magic of Mexico. The photos from her last 6 weeks alive reveal subtle changes that investigators would later identify as warning signs hidden in plain sight. A new man appearing with increasing frequency in her images, her messages home becoming less regular, and eventually, concerning shifts in her appearance including noticeable weight loss, diminished smile, and final photos where her typically confident gaze seemed replaced by something more guarded, her eyes showing what friends and family would later describe as a shadow we all missed until it was too late. Detective Valeria Mendoza of the Mexico City Police Department's Special Crimes Unit would later describe the Rodriguez case as revealing the perfect predatory pattern that transformed what should have been a carefree travel experience into calculated victimization that exploited cultural disorientation, isolation from support networks, and romantic idealization of cross-cultural connection that blinded an otherwise intelligent woman to escalating danger signals until escape became impossible. The investigation uncovered methodical grooming by a practiced manipulator who had targeted multiple foreign women before Emily, though none with such devastating consequences, establishing a timeline of calculated exploitation that began with seeming serendipitous meeting at a popular tourist restaurant and ended 90 days later with her body discovered in an abandoned property outside Mexico City, her disappearance having finally generated the international media attention that forced local authorities to overcome initial reluctance to investigate thoroughly when a foreigner vanishes after extending a tourist visa. Emily Rodriguez had arrived in Cancun on a typically beautiful May morning, the kind of picture-perfect Caribbean day that fulfills every tourism brochure promise and reinforces Mexico's reputation as ideal destination for Americans seeking accessible international experience. Her initial 2-week itinerary centered around college friend Samantha Hayes' destination wedding, with plans including traditional pre-wedding celebrations, the beachfront ceremony itself, and several days of group excursions to nearby attractions before most of the wedding party, including the bride and groom, would return to their professional lives in the United States. Text messages and social media posts from this period show Emily in her element, organizing impromptu beach gatherings, researching best local restaurants beyond tourist zones, and generally serving as enthusiastic cultural ambassador leveraging her fluent Spanish, maintained from childhood in predominantly Latino San Diego neighborhood, and natural extroversion to enhance everyone's experience of Mexican hospitality and traditions. The decision that would ultimately place Emily in fatal danger came during the final days of the wedding celebration, when she announced to surprise friends that she had decided to extend her 2-week vacation to a full month, planning to explore Mexico City and several colonial towns, before eventually returning to her event planning career in San Diego. This spontaneous extension reflected both her adventurous personality and specific life circumstances. She had recently ended a long-term relationship, completed a major work project with accompanying bonus, and felt professionally established enough to request additional unpaid leave from the boutique event company where she had worked for 6 years, with steadily increasing responsibility and creative control. Friends later recalled mild concerns about her solo travel plans, though these were largely alleviated by her Spanish fluency, previous independent international travel experience, and clear excitement about exploring beyond typical tourist experiences in a country whose culture had always fascinated her through family connections and academic interest. The digital breadcrumbs that allowed investigators to reconstruct Emily's final months revealed how her travels progressed from mainstream tourism to increasingly off-the-beaten-path experiences, with her social media documenting transition from luxury resort areas to more authentic neighborhoods in Mexico City, local frequented restaurants, and eventually locations accessible primarily to those with local connections and transportation. The investigation would establish that the critical turning point occurred approximately 3 weeks into her extended stay, when Emily first encountered Alejandro Cruz at a popular restaurant in Mexico City's trendy Roma Norte neighborhood. Their meeting documented in what appeared to be spontaneous group photo that she posted with caption, "Making new friends in Mexico City." When solo travel leads to the best unexpected connections, Magical Mexico, say yes to adventure. Language that poignantly foreshadowed how what seemed like travel serendipity actually represented calculated first contact by someone who had observed her dining alone and recognized vulnerability masked as independence. The relationship between Emily and Alejandro developed with disarming normalcy at first, their early interactions following familiar pattern of tour guide romance that countless travelers experience without tragic outcomes. He showed her hidden gems of his city, introduced her to authentic local experiences beyond guidebook recommendations, and presented himself as sophisticated yet grounded local, eager to share his culture with appreciative foreigner. Text messages to friends back home during this period reveal Emily's initial enchantment with both Mexico itself and this unexpected romantic connection, describing Alejandro as so different from American guys, passionate, present, completely comfortable with emotions, and sharing excitement about experiencing the real Mexico beyond tourist traps. The digital trail shows her original return flight to San Diego canceled approximately 5 weeks into her stay, coinciding with increasing appearance of Alejandro in her social media posts and first subtle indications of isolation, as her communication with friends and family became less frequent while focusing increasingly on her new relationship rather than broader travel experiences. The investigation would eventually establish through witness testimony and electronic evidence that Alejandro Cruz's interest in Emily represented not spontaneous romance but calculated targeting, his pattern of behavior consistent with what domestic violence experts recognize as love bombing, followed by increasing control, isolation, and eventual exploitation. His background, obscured through deliberate misrepresentation during their relationship, included connections to organized crime primarily through nightlife businesses used for money laundering, prior relationships with foreign women that had involved financial exploitation, and history of escalating controlling behavior and violence that previous victims had either escaped by returning to their home countries or endured without formal reports due to justified fears about both his connections and complicated legal status as foreigners with limited Spanish and understanding of local systems. Emily's particular vulnerability lay in combination of her independent travel status, recent emotional breakup that left her receptive to romantic attention, financial resources that made her attractive target, and fateful decision to extend her stay beyond initial plans, creating gradually increasing separation from support networks that might otherwise have recognized warning signs as they developed. The warning signals that appeared in Emily's communications during her final weeks in Mexico reflected textbook patterns of isolation and control, though their gradual intensification meant no single message triggered sufficient alarm among friends or family to prompt intervention before it was too late. Her once frequent social media posts decreased in both frequency and detail, with fewer photographs of herself and more generic tourist images. Messages to close friends became increasingly defensive about her extended stay and new relationship, with concerning statements like, "You just don't understand how different things are here," and "Alejandro gets jealous if I'm always on my phone with people back home instead of being present with him," that domestic violence experts would later identify as classic red flags, indicating growing isolation and control. Most troubling was the communication pattern itself, with reduced frequency interspersed with occasional bursts of contact that seemed designed to prevent anyone from becoming concerned enough to take action, a manipulation technique investigators would determine likely represented Alejandro monitoring and potentially controlling her communications rather than Emily's own natural patterns. The final weeks of Emily Rodriguez's life remain partially obscured despite extensive investigation, with gaps in the timeline that may never be fully reconstructed due to deliberate evidence, destruction, witness intimidation, and the inherent challenges of building case when victim was isolated from regular contact before her disappearance. What investigators established with certainty is that approximately 70 days into what had begun as 2-week wedding attendance, Emily made first documented attempt to extricate herself from increasingly controlling relationship, booking flight back to San Diego and sending urgent text to friend Samantha Hayes that read simply, "Things getting weird with A. Coming home next week. Don't want to explain over text but need to get out." This message, which would later be identified as critical evidence indicating her recognition of danger and attempt to escape, was followed by 24 hours of complete communication silence before resumed contact with bizarrely casual tone, apologizing for dramatic text, and explaining she had just been homesick but worked things out. Language and communication style so discordant with Emily's usual patterns that friends recognized it as concerning but not sufficiently alarming to prompt immediate intervention from thousands of miles away. The official investigation into Emily Rodriguez's disappearance began far too late to prevent tragedy, initiated only after repeated, increasingly desperate inquiries from parents and friends who had gone from concerned to alarmed during 2 weeks of complete communication silence, following months of increasingly sporadic contact. The delayed response reflected troubling patterns in how missing foreigners are sometimes treated by authorities in tourist regions, with initial reports dismissed, with suggestions she had likely just traveled to area with poor cell service or chosen to extend stay without informing family. Assumptions that wasted critical early investigation time and allowed for evidence destruction that significantly complicated subsequent prosecution. Only when her case generated social media attention and pressure from American consular officials did serious investigation begin, eventually leading Detective Mendoza to surveillance footage, witness testimony, and finally physical evidence that revealed not tragic accident or random crime, but deliberate pattern of isolation, control, and ultimately fatal violence, when Emily's final escape attempt threatened Alejandro's sense of possession and control, ending a life that had begun with joyful celebration among friends and concluded in brutal intimacy with someone who had systematically exploited trust, cultural disorientation, and romantic idealization to isolate and ultimately destroy a vibrant woman whose only mistake was believing that her independence and experience had prepared her for dangers she never truly recognized until escape became impossible. The friendship between Emily Rodriguez and Samantha Hayes had begun during their freshman year at UC San Diego, where they met as roommates with seemingly little in common. Emily, the vibrant daughter of a Mexican-American father and Irish-American mother, who had grown up in San Diego's diverse neighborhoods, speaking both English and Spanish fluently. Samantha, the more reserved child of Connecticut, professionals who had never lived outside predominantly white suburban communities before college. Their unexpected bond formed through complementary strengths, Emily drawing out Samantha's hidden adventurous side, while Samantha providing grounding pragmatism that occasionally tempered Emily's impulsivity. Their relationship had evolved through undergraduate adventures, post-college career establishments, and various romantic relationships, maintaining consistent friendship despite periods of geographical separation and life's inevitable complications. Samantha's decision to hold her wedding in Cancun reflected both her transformation through friendship with Emily, who had introduced her to Mexican culture and language throughout college, and practical considerations, since her fiancé's large Brazilian family would find Mexico more accessible than Connecticut for the international celebration they envisioned. The wedding celebration that brought Emily to Mexico had been meticulously planned over 18 months, with professionally arranged accommodations, activities, and transportation designed to create seamless experience for 80 guests, primarily from United States and Brazil, with careful attention to creating authentic cultural touches while maintaining comfort levels appropriate for predominantly non-Spanish-speaking visitors experiencing Mexico for the first time. Emily's role had evolved beyond typical bridesmaid duties to unofficial cultural ambassador, with both her professional event planning expertise and personal background, making her invaluable resource for everything from menu recommendations that would satisfy diverse international palates to negotiating with local vendors when communication challenges arose. Her comfort moving between English and Spanish, navigating cultural expectations, and troubleshooting inevitable destination. Wedding complications earned appreciation from fellow guests, while reinforcing her self-image as seasoned traveler capable of handling unfamiliar situations, confidence that would later factor fatally into her decision to extend her stay and explore beyond tourist zones without the protective infrastructure of organized wedding activities and group dynamics. The extended friend group that witnessed Emily's last carefree days during the wedding celebration later provided investigators with crucial baseline understanding of her typical behavior, communication patterns, and decision-making processes before Alejandro's influence began. Their collective testimony established her as independent but not reckless, adventurous within reasonable boundaries, and typically maintaining regular communication with consistent tone and language patterns when traveling, all factors that would help identify significant deviations during her final months. Particularly important was documentation of her normal approach to romantic interests, which friends characterized as enthusiastic but self-aware, typically involving excited sharing of details with close friends and maintaining normal social connections, rather than rapid relationship immersion. This understanding would later help investigators recognize how dramatically her behavior patterns changed once Alejandro's influence and isolation tactics took hold, creating contrast between her typical relationship approach and the troubling intensity that developed in her final relationship. The pre-wedding celebrations in Cancun showcased Emily in her natural element, with video and photographic evidence documenting her comfort, facilitating connections between different social circles, navigating between American and Mexican cultural contexts, and generally maintaining the warm, confident presence that friends and family recognized as her authentic self. Particularly notable was group excursion to nearby cenote, natural limestone sinkhole, where Emily's Spanish fluency had resolved confusion about transportation logistics, her natural leadership emerging without dominating as she helped less travel-experienced guests navigate unfamiliar experiences with appropriate cultural respect and adventure-embracing attitude. These moments, preserved through social media posts and wedding photographers' candid shots, would provide poignant contrast to the increasingly constrained and isolated presence she projected in final weeks of her life when under Alejandro's influence and control. The wedding itself, a sunset beach ceremony followed by reception at luxury resort overlooking Caribbean waters, represented peak moment of connection before Emily's fateful decision to separate from the group and extend her stay independently. Wedding video captured her maid of honor toast delivered confidently in alternating English and Spanish to accommodate diverse guests, her genuine affection for the couple, evident alongside characteristic humor and thoughtfulness that friends would later reference when describing the vibrant person they had lost. The planned group activities continued for several days following ceremony, with organized excursions to Mayan ruins, snorkeling expeditions, and beachfront gatherings creating structured experiences that Emily enjoyed while increasingly expressing interest in more authentic Mexican experiences beyond carefully managed tourist presentations. Conversations that foreshadowed her eventual decision to continue exploring independently after wedding festivities concluded. The announcement of Emily's decision to extend her trip came during final group dinner before most guests would depart, her excitement evident as she shared plans to explore Mexico City and several colonial towns before eventually returning to San Diego. Friends' reactions mixed enthusiasm with mild concern, though any reservations were largely alleviated by her Spanish fluency, previous travel experience, and clear joy regarding the opportunity for extended cultural immersion after years focused on career development. The specific circumstances enabling her spontaneous extension included accumulated vacation time, supportive employer willing to grant additional unpaid leave, financially responsible habits that had created savings buffer, and recent breakup from long-term relationship that had left her feeling need for transformative experience before returning to normal life rhythms in California. These legitimate factors created perfect cover for decision that seemed reasonable and consistent with her established personality, while ultimately placing her in vulnerable position without support systems that had characterized the structured wedding portion of her Mexican journey. The transition from Cancun's wedding celebrations to independent travel proceeded smoothly at first, with Emily maintaining regular communication with friends and family as she navigated to Mexico City and established herself in charming boutique hotel in Roma Norte neighborhood, recommended by Mexican-American colleagues from San Diego. Her initial social media posts and messages during this period reflected genuine travelers' excitement, documenting visits to major attractions, including National Anthropology Museum, Frida Kahlo Museum, and weekend excursion to Teotihuacan pyramids, interspersed with observations about daily life, cultural differences, and gastronomic adventures in local restaurants beyond typical tourist establishments. This communication maintained her characteristic voice, enthusiastic but thoughtful, with balanced perspective, appreciating cultural differences while acknowledging occasional challenges of solo female travel in unfamiliar environments. Her Spanish fluency clearly enhanced these early independent experiences, allowing her to navigate local transportation systems, engage with residents beyond tourist industry, and generally access more authentic experiences than typical English-only visitors, capabilities that both enriched her journey and created fateful opportunity for connection with Alejandro, who recognized her unusual combination of independence, language ability, and foreign vulnerability. The digital reconstruction of Emily's movements established her initial encounter with Alejandro Cruz occurred at Contramar, upscale seafood restaurant popular with both locals and tourists in Roma Norte neighborhood, approximately 3 weeks into her extended stay and 5 weeks before her disappearance. Security footage later recovered showed what appeared to be spontaneous meeting when she dined alone at lunch counter, though investigation would reveal patterns suggesting he had likely observed her previously and orchestrated seemingly chance encounter. Their initial conversation, partially captured on restaurant security cameras, showed textbook charming behavior, attentive listening, appropriate humor, cultural knowledge sharing, presenting himself as sophisticated local professional with legitimate business interests in nightlife industry, rather than revealing connections to organized crime operations and pattern of targeting foreign women for exploitation and control. Emily's social media post from that day, showing group photo, including Alejandro, marked first digital evidence of connection that would ultimately lead to her death, though the seemingly casual image offered no indication of the calculated targeting it actually represented. The rapid relationship development following initial meeting followed recognizable pattern that domestic violence experts would later identify as love bombing, intense romantic attention, seemingly perfect alignment of interests and values, rapid intimacy development, and constant presence that felt like devoted interest rather than surveillance and control. Text messages Emily sent to close friends during this period revealed her genuine enchantment, describing Alejandro as showing me the real Mexico that tourists never see, and expressing excitement about experiencing cultural aspects inaccessible without local connection. Her communication during these early relationship weeks maintained normal patterns while focusing increasingly on her new romantic interest, with friends noting appropriate enthusiasm without concerning intensity that might have triggered earlier intervention. This period represented critical grooming phase, where Alejandro established trust, romantic connection, and perceived cultural authority that would later facilitate isolation tactics and control mechanisms. Once emotional dependency had been established through intense romantic experience, deliberately designed to create powerful attachment, before revealing more controlling aspects of his personality and expectations. The transformation in Emily's communication patterns began subtly approximately 6 weeks into her stay and 3 weeks into relationship with Alejandro, with first concerning indicators including decreased frequency of contact with friends and family, shorter and less detailed messages when communication did occur, and social media posts shifting from diverse experiences to increasing focus on relationship activities or generic tourist images rather than personal photos. Friends noticed these changes but initially attributed them to natural honeymoon phase of new relationship rather than recognizing warning signs of isolation tactics typical in controlling relationships. Particularly significant was gradual withdrawal from longtime friends who had been reliable communication touchpoints throughout her previous travels, with messages becoming briefer and less substantive when they did come, often at unusual hours, inconsistent with her previous communication patterns, changes that raised mild concerns, but not sufficient alarm to prompt intervention from thousands of miles away, when each individual message seemed plausibly explained by time zone differences, shifting travel schedules, or normal distraction of new romance in exciting foreign setting. The gradual isolation tactics that separated Emily from her support networks reflected textbook patterns that domestic violence experts would later identify as deliberately calculated rather than coincidental relationship evolution, with Alejandro systematically creating both physical and psychological distance between Emily and anyone who might recognize danger signals or provide assistance as controlling behavior escalated. The digital evidence recovered during investigation documented specific mechanisms, including persuading her to change accommodations from established hotel with international clientele and security protocols to apartment in neighborhood, where he claimed she would experience more authentic Mexico, suggesting her constant communication with American friends indicated lack of cultural immersion and genuine travel experience, and gradually introducing her to social circles composed exclusively of his associates who reinforced his narratives and authority rather than providing independent perspectives or potential support. These tactics, implemented gradually over several weeks, transformed Emily from confidently independent traveler to increasingly isolated foreign visitor, whose primary social connection and cultural interpreter was the very person methodically separating her from alternative viewpoints. Support resources. The relationship evolution between Emily and Alejandro followed pattern documented in other controlling relationships, but accelerated through specific vulnerabilities created by her status as foreigner in unfamiliar environment despite language fluency that created false sense of security. Witness testimony from restaurant staff, transportation providers, and neighbors established trajectory from initial charming attentiveness to increasingly possessive behavior, with public arguments observed approximately 6 weeks into relationship, where his control mechanisms became more visible in settings, including restaurant where he criticized her conversation with waiter, the cultural site, where he responded with disproportionate anger when she spoke with American tourists who asked for photograph assistance, and taxi, whose driver later reported concerning interaction when Emily briefly mentioned considering return to San Diego. These public manifestations of control represented mere glimpses of private dynamics that investigation would determine included monitoring her communications, criticizing connections to home, and eventually explicit threats when she began recognizing danger and expressing desire to end relationship and return to United States. The financial exploitation component emerged gradually, with banking records revealing pattern of increasing financial entanglement that domestic violence experts recognize as common control tactic, creating practical barriers to separation. The progression began innocuously, with Alejandro offering to handle transactions to avoid tourist prices, evolved to holding her credit cards for safekeeping due to alleged pickpocketing risks, and culminated in significant withdrawals and transfers that investigators would determine occurred under duress during final weeks before her disappearance. This financial control created practical dependency, complementing emotional manipulation, with Emily finding herself increasingly without independent resources in foreign country, where her diminishing external connections left her with limited options as she began recognizing danger, but facing significant barriers. Extrication. As Alejandro systematically restricted her independence through combination of psychological manipulation, financial control, and eventually monitoring her movements through associates, including Diego Morales, whose taxi service provided transportation that was actually surveillance, ensuring she couldn't leave without detection. The critical turning point identified through digital evidence occurred approximately 65 days into Emily's stay, when she made first documented attempt to extract herself from deteriorating situation, sending urgent message to friend Samantha Hayes that investigation would determine was composed and sent during brief period when she had access to phone while Alejandro was occupied with business meeting. The message, "Things getting weird with A. Coming home next week. Don't want to explain over text but need to get out," represented momentary window of clarity and help, seeking before control mechanisms were reasserted, with subsequent communications reverting to uncharacteristically casual tone and phrasing that forensic linguistic analysis would later determine likely represented Alejandro composing messages using her phone rather than authentic communication. This brief, authentic message provided crucial evidence that Emily had recognized danger and attempted to seek assistance, contradicting initial investigative theories about willing participation or accident, while the subsequent communication pattern demonstrated classic manipulation techniques designed to prevent concerned friends or family from taking action based on the momentary glimpse of her actual situation and fear. The role of Diego Morales as facilitator emerged through investigation that initially identified him simply as taxi driver, frequently providing transportation for the couple, before witness testimony and electronic evidence established his deeper involvement as Alejandro's associate who provided surveillance, ensuring Emily couldn't leave without detection, transported her to increasingly isolated locations where escape options were limited, and eventually assisted in evidence removal following her murder. His cooperation with investigation following arrest revealed troubling insights into how he had rationalized participation, claiming he just provided rides and didn't ask questions, despite recognizing concerning dynamics including Emily's visible injuries during later transport incidents. Overheard arguments where Alejandro made explicit threats, and ultimately involvement in transporting her body after final confrontation turned fatal. His testimony provided investigators with crucial timeline details while demonstrating how peripheral participants enable predators through willful blindness, profit motivation, and moral disengagement that allows them to facilitate victimization while avoiding personal responsibility for their essential enabling role. The documented physical abuse began approximately 9 weeks into Emily's stay, according to witness testimony, subsequently corroborated through medical evidence, with first public incident occurring at restaurant, where server observed bruising partially concealed by makeup and clothing, followed by sequence of increasingly concerning observations from various witnesses, including hotel cleaner who reported significant bruising, pharmacy clerk who assisted with purchase of bandages and pain relievers, and emergency room intake staff, who treated unexplained injuries recorded under apparent supervision approximately 10 days before her disappearance. These medical records, initially created under false name but later connected to Emily through fingerprint matching, documented injuries including wrist fracture, consistent with defensive wound, and facial contusions requiring sutures, with intake notes indicating patient accompanied by controlling male partner who answered questions and prevented private consultation, observations that should have triggered protective protocols but failed due to communication barriers, limited training on domestic violence involving foreign visitors, and Emily's apparent reluctance to seek help while under supervision, and likely threat from perpetrator, who maintained constant presence throughout medical interaction. The attempts at help-seeking documented during final weeks showed Emily's growing recognition of danger and increasingly desperate efforts to escape deteriorating situation, despite significant barriers created through systematic isolation. Beyond the critical text message to Samantha, evidence included attempted call to American consulate that call records show was disconnected abruptly, a conversation with hotel concierge, where witness recalled Emily inquiring about secure transportation to airport before being interrupted by Alejandro's arrival, and interaction with American tourist at restaurant bathroom, where Emily reportedly asked for phone to make call before companion returned and terminated conversation. These moments represented brief windows where control mechanisms momentarily failed, providing glimpses of her increasing fear and recognition of danger that investigation would determine reflected growing abuse and explicit threats during private interactions, where Alejandro reportedly threatened consequences if she attempted to leave, claiming connections to authorities that would prevent any effective help-seeking. Claims that investigation would determine had some factual basis through his organized crime connections that had indeed compromised some local law enforcement contacts. The final 72 hours of Emily Rodriguez's life remain partially obscured despite extensive investigation, with timeline reconstructed through combination of witness testimony, electronic evidence, and forensic analysis establishing sequence beginning with heated public argument observed at restaurant where Emily reportedly stated intention to return to United States immediately, followed by return to apartment where neighbors reported sounds of altercation, subsequent transportation to more isolated location by Diego Morales based on his eventual testimony, and final confrontation at remote property outside Mexico City, where investigation would determine fatal violence occurred following what appeared to be serious escape attempt based on physical evidence, including packed suitcase, printed flight, confirmation, and defensive wounds suggesting violent struggle rather than submission. The exact circumstances of her death remain partially unconfirmed, though medical examiners' findings established manual strangulation as cause of death, following significant non-fatal injuries, indicating extended assault rather than momentary loss of control. The evidence destruction efforts that followed demonstrated calculated response rather than panic, with Alejandro and Diego implementing pre-planned concealment strategies, showing awareness of forensic investigation techniques and specific efforts to eliminate evidence that suggested prior planning for potential violent outcome rather than spontaneous response to unexpected situation. The discovery of Emily's body came through anonymous tip, eventually traced to associate of Diego Morales, who had become concerned about potential personal criminal exposure, with initial police response revealing sophisticated concealment efforts that would have likely prevented discovery without specific information provided by someone with knowledge of the location and circumstances. The crime scene processing revealed calculated attempts to eliminate evidence, including use of chemicals to degrade biological evidence, removal of identifying items including Emily's phone and identification documents, and staging that initially suggested robbery or random violence rather than domestic homicide. These efforts might have succeeded in preventing case resolution without Detective Valeria Mendoza's persistence in pursuing international cooperation, obtaining digital records from U.S. providers that American authorities could access more readily than Mexican investigators, and cultivating confidential informants within Alejandro's organization, who eventually provided crucial testimony in exchange for consideration in unrelated criminal matters. Her methodical approach, informed by specialized training in domestic violence dynamics and international case cooperation, transformed what might have become merely statistical entry in missing tourist database into fully developed homicide investigation that ultimately provided Emily's family with answers about her fate while establishing accountability for perpetrators whose previous victims had likely escaped with trauma but without justice due to international barriers to effective investigation and prosecution. The official investigation into Emily Rodriguez's disappearance began far too late to prevent tragedy, but ultimately provided rare accountability in case that might otherwise have remained unresolved without Detective Mendoza's specialized expertise and dedication to overcoming institutional barriers that often prevent thorough investigation when foreign visitors disappear in tourist destinations. The initial response reflected troubling patterns in how such cases are sometimes handled, with first reports from concerned family members met with suggestions that communication gaps likely reflected vacation extension, technology limitations in remote areas, or simple distraction rather than danger requiring immediate attention. This institutional minimization delayed crucial early investigation by approximately 10 days after last confirmed communication, creating critical evidence gap as Alejandro implemented concealment strategies that significantly complicated subsequent prosecution efforts. The international pressure that eventually forced serious investigative response came through combination of social media campaign organized by Emily's friends that generated substantial public attention, formal diplomatic inquiries from American consular officials responding to family concerns, and eventually media coverage that created sufficient public awareness to overcome institutional inertia and resource limitations that might otherwise have relegated her case to growing file of unresolved disappearances. These external pressures brought case to attention of Detective Mendoza, whose specialized domestic violence investigation training and previous experience with cases involving foreign victims made her particularly qualified to recognize and pursue evidence patterns that generalist investigators might have overlooked or misinterpreted, especially given deliberate misdirection efforts implemented by perpetrators to suggest random crime or voluntary disappearance rather than relationship homicide. The breakthrough investigative insight came through Detective Mendoza's recognition of relationship violence patterns rather than random criminal opportunity, shifting investigative focus from generalized query about tourist movements to specific examination of Emily's developing relationship with Alejandro and documented behavior changes during her extended stay. This perspective transformation allowed more productive evidence gathering focused on relationship timeline, communication pattern changes, witness observations of controlling behaviors, and financial record anomalies that collectively established clear pattern of isolation, control, and eventual fatal violence following classic domestic abuse trajectory rather than random criminal victimization. This framework, supported by Mendoza's specialized training and reinforced through consultation with American domestic violence investigation experts, created an investigative roadmap that ultimately overcame deliberate evidence, destruction, and jurisdictional complications that might otherwise have prevented case resolution. The digital forensics that provided crucial investigative foundation required unprecedented international cooperation, with Mexican authorities working through diplomatic channels to access records from American service providers, including social media platforms, cloud storage services, and financial institutions that documented critical timeline elements and relationship evolution that physical evidence alone could not establish due to extensive concealment efforts. Particularly important was recovery of deleted communications and location data from Emily's accounts that Alejandro had attempted to purge, but remained available through legal process directed to American companies maintaining backup data beyond reach of his destruction efforts. These records established a pattern of increasingly controlling behavior, documented Emily's growing recognition of danger and attempts to seek assistance, and provided timeline details that directly contradicted Alejandro's claims about his whereabouts and activities during critical periods surrounding her disappearance and death. The witness testimony that transformed theoretical case into prosecutable homicide came through Detective Mendoza's methodical community canvassing and cultivation of confidential informants within Alejandro's social and business circles, developing information sources who eventually provided crucial details about relationship dynamics, observed abuse incidents, and ultimately specific knowledge about Emily's final days that physical and digital evidence alone could not establish. Particularly significant was testimony from Rosa Alvarez, former girlfriend who initially feared providing information due to Alejandro's reputation for retaliation, but eventually documented history of similar controlling behavior and violence in their prior relationship that established pattern crucial for undermining defense claims about accidental death or isolated incident. Her testimony, combined with accounts from service workers, neighbors, and eventually Diego Morales following his arrest and decision to cooperate in exchange for charging considerations, created comprehensive narrative of deliberate pattern culminating in fatal violence rather than momentary loss of control that defense would attempt to establish as alternative explanation. The international coordination challenges that complicated investigation reflected broader issues in transnational criminal cases, with jurisdictional boundaries, creating procedural hurdles that Detective Mendoza navigated through combination of formal diplomatic channels and informal professional relationships with American law enforcement counterparts who assisted with accessing records, interviewing witnesses who had returned to United States, and developing evidence admissible under both legal systems despite procedural differences that might otherwise have created exclusionary issues at trial. This cooperation, unusual in its extensiveness and effectiveness, reflected recognition from authorities in both countries about high-profile nature of case involving American victim and implications for tourism industry, dependent on visitor perception of safety and effective justice response when crimes do occur despite prevention efforts. The arrest of Alejandro Cruz occurred following methodical evidence development rather than immediate response to discovery of Emily's body, with Detective Mendoza building comprehensive case before attempting apprehension to ensure sufficient evidence existed for successful prosecution rather than risking procedural dismissal or release due to evidentiary limitations that might have allowed him to escape justice permanently. The tactical operation involved coordination between specialized police units with organized crime expertise, recognizing Alejandro's connections and potential for violent resistance or flight, given his resources and criminal network relationships. His capture at Mexico City restaurant represented rare accountability moment for someone whose prior victimization of women had apparently proceeded without consequence due to combination of factors including victims returning to home countries before completing legal processes, witness intimidation, and compromise of some local officials through corruption that higher-level federal authorities eventually overcame through careful case building and strategic prosecution timing. The secondary arrest of Diego Morales provided crucial additional evidence through eventual cooperation, with initial denial evolving to limited admission and finally comprehensive testimony, as he recognized potential consequences and legal advantages of cooperation against primary perpetrator. His detailed account of transportation assistance, observations of relationship deterioration, and ultimately, knowledge of specific events surrounding Emily's death provided investigation with timeline elements that might otherwise have remained speculative, particularly regarding final days, when Emily had no external communications and movements, could only be reconstructed through physical evidence and witness testimony, rather than digital footprint that had documented earlier relationship phases. His moral compartmentalization revealed through interrogation demonstrated classic enabling patterns, with claims of minimal knowledge and limited involvement gradually giving way to admissions of increasing awareness and participation, as investigation methodically dismantled his denials through contradictory evidence and strategic information revelation during extended questioning sessions that eventually yielded comprehensive account of his role in both extended control period and ultimate homicide concealment efforts. The evidential challenges that complicated prosecution reflected both jurisdictional differences and deliberate concealment efforts, with Mexican legal system requiring different procedural elements than American counterparts would have in similar domestic violence homicide, creating complexity that Detective Mendoza navigated through consultation with specialized prosecutors experienced in both domestic violence cases and matters involving foreign victims. Particularly challenging were chain of custody issues resulting from delayed investigation, initiation, evidence destruction efforts by perpetrators, and necessity of integrating digital records obtained through international legal processes with physical evidence and witness testimony developed locally. The resulting case represented unusual success in overcoming barriers that frequently prevent resolution when crimes cross national boundaries, with comprehensive integration of multiple evidence sources, creating resilient prosecution theory that could withstand defense challenges and jurisdictional complications through redundant proof patterns rather than reliance on any single evidence category that might have been vulnerable to procedural challenge or exclusion. The media coverage that developed as case progressed reflected problematic patterns in reporting about violence against women generally and foreign victims specifically, with early coverage emphasizing missing tourist narrative that subtly suggested personal responsibility through traveling alone in dangerous location rather than recognizing systematic predatory targeting by calculating perpetrator who had likely victimized others before Emily without facing consequences. This framing evolved somewhat as investigation revealed relationship violence dynamics rather than random criminality, though sensationalist elements persisted in some coverage that emphasized exotic location and cross-cultural elements rather than universal patterns of control, isolation and violence that domestic violence experts recognized as tragically common across cultural contexts. More thoughtful analysis eventually emerged through in-depth reporting that examined both case-specific evidence and broader patterns affecting vulnerable travelers, particularly women navigating unfamiliar environments without awareness of how predators specifically exploit cultural disorientation, language barriers, and romantic idealization to create vulnerability that their experience and independence in familiar contexts might otherwise prevent. The trial of Alejandro Cruz began 11 months after Emily's murder, following extensive evidence development, procedural maneuvering by defense attorneys attempting to exclude crucial elements, and careful preparation by specialized prosecution team with expertise in both domestic violence cases and matters involving foreign victims that present unique challenges in Mexican courts. The proceedings took place under unusual security measures, reflecting both high-profile nature of case and specific threats detected against witnesses, including Rosa Alvarez and Diego Morales, whose testimony directly contradicted Alejandro's claims of innocence and established pattern of deliberate targeting, controlling behavior, and ultimately fatal violence following Emily's final escape attempt. The courtroom itself became international focal point as Emily's family, American diplomatic representatives, and media from both countries observed proceedings that would test whether justice systems could effectively address crimes, targeting vulnerable visitors when perpetrators had resources, connections, and sophisticated understanding of investigative limitations they could potentially exploit to avoid accountability. The prosecution strategy developed by a specialized legal team working closely with Detective Mendoza focused on establishing three core elements: the methodical predatory pattern revealed through relationship development, isolation tactics, and escalating control, the documented history of similar behavior with previous partners, establishing that Emily's case represented pattern escalation rather than isolated incident, and the physical evidence contradicting alternative explanations, including accident, suicide, or random criminal opportunity. This comprehensive approach addressed anticipated defense claims while building redundant evidence paths that could withstand procedural challenges to any single element, creating resilient case theory capable of overcoming both jurisdictional complications and deliberate evidence destruction efforts that might otherwise have prevented successful prosecution. The testimony of Detective Mendoza provided evidentiary foundation through methodical presentation, detailing investigation development from initial missing person inquiry through international evidence gathering, witness identification, and ultimate case resolution through comprehensive integration of digital forensics, physical evidence, and witness accounts. Her presentation, supported by forensic photographs, timeline graphics, and detailed communications analysis, established central elements of predatory targeting by documenting the sequence from initial chance meeting through relationship development, increasing isolation, financial exploitation, and ultimately fatal violence following Emily's recognition of danger and attempt to escape. This comprehensive chronology directly countered defense claims of accidental death or impulsive action by demonstrating calculated pattern consistent with domestic violence homicide following extended control period rather than isolated emotional incident. The digital evidence presented by forensic experts provided jurors with detailed understanding of relationship evolution through recovered communications, location data, financial records, and social media content that collectively documented transition from Emily's initial independent travel experience through relationship development and ultimately concerning changes in both communication patterns and physical appearance visible in photographs over time. Particularly significant was analysis showing how Emily's authentic communication voice changed in final weeks, with linguistic experts documenting likely third-party authorship of messages purportedly from her during periods when investigation established Alejandro had taken control of her devices and was likely impersonating her to prevent concerned intervention from distant friends and family who might otherwise have recognized danger signals in communication changes. This evidence directly undermined defense claims about relationship nature by establishing control patterns consistent with domestic violence rather than consensual romantic partnership. The testimony of Rosa Alvarez proved crucial, despite defense attempts to exclude or discredit her account, with her description of prior relationship with Alejandro establishing behavioral pattern that directly paralleled Emily's experience, though fortunately ending with escape rather than fatal violence. Her account documented similar targeting approach, love bombing techniques, isolation tactics, and eventually controlling behaviors and physical abuse that she had survived by returning to family in another region of Mexico where his influence couldn't reach her. The defense vigorously attacked her credibility through suggestions of motivation by jealousy or financial interest, but her testimony remained consistent under cross-examination, while specific behavioral patterns she described aligned precisely with evidence from Emily's case, including particular controlling tactics, surveillance methods, and progression from charming attentiveness to possessive control. Similarities too specific to represent coincidence rather than established behavioral pattern by repeat perpetrator whose violence had escalated with subsequent victim. The cooperating testimony of Diego Morales provided crucial timeline elements, particularly regarding Emily's final days when other evidence sources were limited due to her complete isolation and communications blackout. His account, offered in exchange for reduced charges acknowledging his accessory role, detailed observations of relationship deterioration, specific incidents of observed injuries and controlling behaviors, and ultimately comprehensive timeline of events surrounding Emily's final escape attempt and the fatal confrontation that followed. His testimony particularly established Alejandro's calculated response rather than emotional reaction, describing methodical evidence removal, body transportation, and staging efforts that demonstrated awareness of forensic investigation techniques and deliberate attempt to prevent case resolution rather than panicked response to unplanned incident. This account directly contradicted defense narrative of accidental death during mutual altercation, instead establishing intentional homicide following extensive pattern of escalating control and abuse. The expert testimony on domestic violence dynamics provided crucial context, helping jurors understand seemingly contradictory elements, including why Emily remained in an increasingly dangerous situation, despite previous independence, and apparent escape opportunities that might seem obvious to those unfamiliar with relationship violence patterns. Dr. Elena Vasquez, specialist in intimate partner violence with particular focus on cross-cultural contexts, explained how travel vulnerability, language barriers despite Spanish fluency, financial control, and psychological manipulation created progressive entrapment that limited perceived options, while isolation tactics systematically removed potential support resources that might otherwise have facilitated escape before fatal violence occurred. This testimony particularly addressed defense suggestions that Emily's continued presence indicated consensual relationship rather than victimization, helping jurors understand sophisticated manipulation techniques and structural barriers that prevent many victims from escaping dangerous relationships despite recognition of escalating danger. The defense strategy centered on three alternative narratives, suggesting Emily's death resulted from accident during mutual confrontation rather than intentional homicide, attacking credibility of cooperating witnesses, including Diego Morales and Rosa Alvarez, through claims of self-interest and inconsistencies, and introducing cultural context, suggesting relationship dynamics reflected Mexican romantic traditions rather than controlling behavior by American standards. This approach faced significant challenges from comprehensive evidence development that limited effectiveness of any single counter-narrative, with physical evidence contradicting accident theory, witness testimony remaining consistent despite vigorous cross-examination, and cultural experts systematically dismantling stereotypical claims about relationship expectations that defense attempted to normalize as cultural differences, rather than recognizing universal patterns of control and abuse that transcend specific cultural contexts, while manifesting through locally relevant mechanisms. The closing arguments presented stark contrasting narratives, with prosecution methodically summarizing evidence, establishing predatory pattern, targeting vulnerable traveler, systematic isolation and control tactics consistent with domestic violence dynamics, and ultimately intentional homicide, following Emily's attempt to escape relationship she had recognized as dangerous. The defense closing attempted to reframe evidence through lens of cultural misunderstanding, suggesting American perspectives on relationship dynamics failed to appreciate Mexican romantic traditions while emphasizing inconsistencies in witness testimony and alternative explanations for physical evidence. These competing frameworks established central tension that would guide jury deliberations, contrasting prosecution's comprehensive evidence integration against defense, attempts to create reasonable doubt through alternative explanations, and credibility challenges regarding key witnesses whose testimony provided crucial narrative continuity, explaining relationship evolution from initial meeting through fatal conclusion. The jury deliberations lasted approximately 14 hours across 3 days, with questions sent to judge indicating particular focus on timeline inconsistencies defense had emphasized, credibility assessment of cooperating witnesses, and request for clarification about legal standards regarding premeditation under Mexican law, which differs somewhat from American equivalent. The verdict ultimately delivered guilty finding on charges equivalent to first-degree murder under American legal framework, with jury, forewoman, later explaining in post-trial interview that digital evidence proving systematic control pattern had been particularly convincing in establishing intentional rather than accidental death, supported by physical evidence, contradicting defense, accident narrative, and witness testimony, establishing behavioral patterns consistent with domestic violence, homicide, following extended control period, rather than isolated emotional incident. The sentencing phase that followed conviction introduced broader considerations beyond guilt determination, with Mexican legal system providing structured hearing, where both prosecution and defense presented arguments regarding appropriate punishment within guidelines established for homicide, with aggravating factors including for premeditation, particular cruelty, and victim vulnerability. Emily's family provided impact statements describing devastating consequences of her death, with particularly moving testimony from her mother, describing how Emily's adventurous spirit and cultural openness represented family values of connection across boundaries rather than fear or isolation, making her targeting by someone who exploited those very qualities, especially tragic violation of principles that had shaped her approach to world and others throughout her life. These personal reflections helped humanize Emily beyond case evidence, establishing her as multidimensional individual whose life contained meaning and potential extinguished through calculated violence, rather than merely statistical entry in crime records or cautionary example in travel advisories. The sentence imposed by Judge Carmelita Ortega, 30 years imprisonment without possibility of early release, represented near maximum punishment available under Mexican legal framework, with judicial remarks specifically addressing how case reflected sophisticated predatory targeting, requiring comprehensive societal response, rather than viewing incident as isolated tragedy or random criminal opportunity. The sentencing statement particularly noted how case evidence established patterns suggesting previous similar victimization had likely occurred without reaching similar justice resolution due to international complications, vulnerability factors affecting foreign victims specifically, and deliberate exploitation of systemic limitations by perpetrator, who understood how cross-jurisdictional barriers often prevent effective investigation and prosecution when victims return to home countries before legal processes conclude or lack resources and support to navigate unfamiliar systems during traumatic aftermath of victimization. The secondary sentencing of Diego Morales acknowledged his cooperation while still holding him accountable for essential enabling role, with 8-year prison term reflecting both accessory liability and recognition that his eventual assistance had provided crucial evidence, without which case resolution might have proven impossible despite Detective Mendoza's dedicated investigation. The judicial determination explicitly rejected his claims of minimal knowledge and involvement, noting that witness testimony established clear awareness of relationship violence and active participation in isolation tactics through transportation services that systematically separated Emily from potential escape options, assistance resources. This accountability for supporting role, rather than direct perpetration, represented important precedent in addressing comprehensive responsibility patterns beyond primary perpetrator, recognizing how seemingly peripheral participants often provide essential practical assistance, without which predatory behaviors would face greater practical barriers and potential intervention opportunities. The media response to case resolution reflected evolving understanding about violence against women generally, and particular vulnerabilities affecting travelers specifically, with more thoughtful coverage, examining systemic factors rather than simplistic warnings about dangerous destinations or victim-blaming narratives, suggesting Emily should have recognized danger earlier or made different choices that might have prevented victimization. This perspective shift particularly emphasized how predatory targeting deliberately exploits reasonable trust and cross-cultural openness rather than recklessness or naivety, with experts highlighting how Alejandro's calculated approach would likely have succeeded with many victims, regardless of general awareness or precautionary measures, given his sophisticated understanding of vulnerability factors and systematic grooming techniques specifically designed to bypass normal caution mechanisms through gradual trust development before revealing controlling aspects that might otherwise trigger earlier recognition and escape. The diplomatic engagement following case conclusion included formal discussions between American and Mexican governmental representatives regarding enhanced cooperation frameworks for cases involving foreign victims, with particular focus on expedited evidence sharing, witness interview protocols spanning jurisdictions, and coordinated support services addressing unique barriers affecting visitors experiencing crime abroad. These conversations acknowledged both investigative complexities when evidence and witnesses span multiple countries and specialized victim support needs when navigating unfamiliar legal systems while processing trauma far from established support networks. The resulting protocols established improved coordination mechanisms that addressed institutional gaps Detective Mendoza had overcome through extraordinary personal commitment and international relationship development that standard procedures had not adequately facilitated, creating systematic improvements rather than relying on exceptional individual efforts that might not be consistently available in future cases involving similar jurisdictional complications. The lasting impact of Emily Rodriguez's case extended far beyond individual justice resolution to inspire systematic improvements in both tourist safety measures and institutional responses when prevention efforts fail, creating meaningful legacy that transformed personal tragedy into catalyst for changes, potentially protecting countless future travelers from similar victimization. The Emily Rodriguez Foundation, established by her family with support from both American and Mexican partners, developed comprehensive education programs addressing realistic risk awareness without promoting fear-based isolation, culturally informed safety strategies, balancing openness with appropriate boundaries, and resource identification, ensuring travelers know how to access assistance if concerning situations develop during international experiences. These initiatives specifically targeted gap between generic travel safety advice and practical reality of cross-cultural relationships, providing nuanced guidance, acknowledging both genuine connection possibilities and specific vulnerability factors requiring thoughtful navigation rather than either fearful avoidance or naive assumption that personal experience and independence provides sufficient protection against sophisticated predatory behaviors specifically designed to bypass normal caution mechanisms. The procedural reforms implemented within Mexican law enforcement following the case included specialized training programs for officers likely to encounter foreign victim reports, with particular focus on recognizing how cultural differences, language barriers despite apparent fluency, and unfamiliarity with local systems create unique vulnerability factors, requiring specific response protocols rather than standard approaches developed primarily for domestic crime patterns. These institutional improvements, developed through collaborative effort between Detective Mendoza and international partners, address specific barriers that had initially delayed effective response to Emily's disappearance, creating systematic enhancements rather than relying on exceptional individual efforts that standard procedures had not adequately supported. The resulting protocols particularly emphasized timely response recognition, enhanced evidence preservation standards, and coordinated communication with foreign authorities whose assistance might prove crucial for digital evidence development, given jurisdictional complications affecting direct access to international service providers whose records often prove essential in cases involving sophisticated perpetrators aware of investigation limitations. The educational impact extended to university study abroad programs, international volunteer organizations, and travel industry partners who collaborated with Emily Rodriguez Foundation to develop realistic preparation materials addressing relationship safety specifically, rather than focusing exclusively on general precautions or random criminal risks that traditional safety orientations typically emphasized. These resources acknowledged both genuine cross-cultural connection benefits and specific vulnerability factors requiring thoughtful navigation, providing balanced guidance, helping travelers recognize concerning patterns without promoting fear-based isolation that would undermine genuine cultural exchange benefits that Emily herself had valued throughout her travels. The resulting programs particularly emphasized communication maintenance with established support networks, recognition of isolation warning signs, financial independence preservation, and resource identification, ensuring travelers know how to access assistance through both local resources and international support systems, specifically designed for visitors facing concerning situations far from familiar support networks. The personal healing journey for Emily's family and friends involved both individual grief processing and finding meaning through advocacy work, transforming personal loss into public education that might prevent similar tragedies, while honoring Emily's genuine love for cross-cultural connection, rather than allowing her death to promote fear-based isolation counter to values she had embodied throughout her life. Her mother became particularly effective advocate, speaking at educational institutions about balancing adventure with awareness, while emphasizing how Emily's victimization reflected sophisticated predatory behavior rather than personal failings or poor choices that simplistic cautionary narratives might suggest. This nuanced approach acknowledged both genuine risks requiring thoughtful navigation and importance of maintaining cultural openness that Emily had valued, rather than responding to tragedy through fear or isolation that would represent additional victimization beyond physical violence by destroying values and connections she had found meaningful throughout her adventures across cultural boundaries. The case study developed from Emily's experience became standard training material for law enforcement across jurisdictions, with Detective Mendoza collaborating with international partners to create comprehensive curriculum addressing unique challenges in cases involving foreign victims, sophisticated perpetrators aware of jurisdictional limitations, and digital evidence spanning multiple countries with different legal frameworks affecting information access and admissibility standards. This educational legacy transformed individual tragedy into professional resource, helping future investigators recognize patterns earlier, develop evidence more effectively across jurisdictional boundaries, and ultimately provide accountability in cases that might otherwise remain unresolved due to structural barriers that had nearly prevented justice in Emily's case, despite dedicated investigation by unusually qualified detective whose specialized expertise and commitment had overcome systematic limitations that standard procedures alone might not have successfully addressed without extraordinary individual effort beyond institutional requirements. The documentary film 90 Days, The Emily Rodriguez Story, premiered 3 years after her death, presenting balanced examination of both case specifics and broader issues affecting vulnerable travelers without resorting to sensationalism or victim-blaming narratives that earlier media coverage had sometimes employed. The film, developed with family cooperation and expert consultation, ensuring both factual accuracy and sensitive treatment of traumatic material, became valuable educational resource used by universities, travel organizations, and law enforcement training programs to illustrate how sophisticated predatory behavior specifically targets vulnerability factors affecting travelers through calculated exploitation of cultural disorientation, isolation from support networks, and romantic idealization rather than random opportunity or poor judgment. This thoughtful treatment helped transform Emily's story from cautionary tale, potentially promoting fear, into educational resource, encouraging thoughtful awareness balanced with cultural openness, reflecting values she had embodied throughout her adventures across boundaries that had brought meaning to her life, despite tragic conclusion resulting from calculated exploitation rather than inherent dangers in cultural exploration itself.